Author and playwright Wilkie Collins first met author, journalist, and playwright Charles Dickens in the spring of 1851 when they were aged respectively 27 and 39. The introduction came via their mutual friend, Augustus Egg, who recruited Collins to Dickens' amateur theatrical company. Dickens, already established as a major novelist, had been editing the weekly Household Words for 2 years, which helped make him a household name, and he was always looking for contributors. Collins, apart from his early journalism, had written only the memoirs of William Collins, R.A., a book about his father, Rambles Beyond Railways, and Antonina. The wonderful Wilkie Collins-info website is relied upon in this video, and it is a great resource for all things Collins. Born to the London painter William Collins and his wife Harriet Geddes, Wilkie moved with his parents to Italy when he was 12, living there and in France for 2 years, learning both Italian and French. He would rely on Italian characters in his most well-known book, The Woman in White. He worked initially as a tea merchant. After Antonina, his first novel, was published in 1850, Collins started meeting more literary people. Collins criticized the institution of marriage, which may be why Dickens became devoted to him later in life due to his own extramarital affair, and Dickens allegedly also asked him to finish the unfinished novel Edwin Drood, which may not have been a bad idea, but Collins turned him down. Collins had relationships with 2 women, the widow Caroline Graves, who lived with him for most of her life, and he treated her daughter Harriet, potentially named for his mother, as his, and the younger Martha Rudd, with whom he had 3 children. He was never legally married. The Collins family moved to 38 Blandford Square, which has been demolished to make way for rail lines, where they used their drawing room for amateur theatricals, which would serve Collins well in his role in the Dickens Fellowship. In 1849, Collins exhibited a painting, The Smuggler's Retreat, at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition. Antonina was published by Richard Bentley in February 1850, as Collins studied law like his father wished. Collins would list himself as a lawyer and not an author when he wanted to evade the law in the later births of his 3 children out of wedlock. Collins, father of the Royal Academy, loomed very large in his life, and he probably took the name Wilkie to differentiate himself from his father, William. Collins went on walking tours of Cornwall with the artist Henry Brandling in July and August 1850. He managed to complete his legal studies and was called to the bar in 1851. Although he never formally practiced, he used his legal knowledge in many of his novels. His novel The Moonstone of 1868 established many of the ground rules of the modern detective novel and is also perhaps the earliest clear example of the police procedural genre, despite the fact it was written in a laudanum haze. Collins effectively joined the Dickens Circle or Dickens Fellowship in March 1851, the date of Dickens' first recorded letter to him, and they met for the first time a week later. Collins rehearsed with the rest of Dickens' company in Not So Bad as We Seem, first performed in May in Devonshire House before the Queen and Prince Consort. Dickens and Collins took to each other at once, and a friendship began which lasted until Dickens' death in 1870, after which Collins became very addicted to opium, which he used to treat his gout. Forster, in his 1873 biography of Dickens, wrote in one of his few references to Collins in that book that Wilkie Collins became, for all the rest of the life of Dickens, one of his dearest and most valued friends. In addition to performing in Not So Bad as We Seem during 1851 and on a highly successful provincial tour in 1852, Collins stayed with Dickens at Camden Crescent, Dover, in the summer of that year, the first of many such visits to Dickens' homes and holiday houses. Collins, always popular with children and having 3 or 4 of his own, enjoyed the family life that Dickens often found burdensome. Collins established a friendship with Catherine Dickens that survived her later separation from her husband. Dickens attended a dance given by Harriet Collins, Collins' adopted or real daughter, we're just not sure, at Hanover Terrace in April 1852, described by Millay, who recalled that Dickens came for about a half an hour and officiated as principal carver. Collins wrote A Terribly Strange Bed, the first of his many contributions to Dickens' household words, in 1852, and was also working on his next full-length novel, Basil, which he completed while staying with Dickens at Dover. Although Dickens admired the novel and appreciated Collins' early work, he was careful to prioritize his readership. A few months later, in February 1853, he instructed his subordinate Wills to reject Collins' story of hereditary insanity, Mad Monkton, fearing readers would object to it. However, Dickens became increasingly influenced by Collins' ability to convey grotesque themes later in life. The association rapidly became one in which work and play were bound together. Dickens invited Collins to go off on various jaunts with him, which would supply material for household words. They were often seen dining together at Veery's restaurant, where a special table was always reserved for them, and they prowled the nighttime streets of London and Paris together, visiting music and dance halls and potentially gambling halls, which Wilkie wrote about. In December 1853, Dickens wrote from Tavistock House, "I am open to any proposal to go anywhere, any day, or days this week. Fresh air and change in any amount I am ready for. If only I could find an idle man, this is a general observation, he would find the warmest recognition in this direction." Perhaps Dickens was trying to be funny, because Collins was anything but idle, producing dozens of works throughout his life. Soon they were planning an excursion to Italy with Augustus Egg. Meanwhile, Dickens accepted Collins' Gabriel's Marriage, published in April 1853, and Collins had begun his next novel, Hide and Seek. That summer, Dickens took his entire family to the Villa de Molyneux at Boulogne and invited Collins at the end of June. Unfortunately, Collins suffered his first bout of serious illness that year, potentially gout or perhaps the early indications of laudanum withdrawal, and was only able to travel at the end of July. He returned to London in September to discuss Hide and Seek, accompanying Dickens, who was finalizing the arrangements for his just completed Bleak House. The Italian trip began in October. Dickens, the undisputed leader, planned the route, which took the 3 travelers through France, Switzerland, and Italy. Though Dickens' letters are full of complaints about the irritating habits of his traveling companions, with Collins going through laudanum withdrawal in Switzerland, Collins' letters are enthusiastic and very complimentary about his friend Dickens. The 3 arrived home in London in December. Dickens began work at the end of January 1854 on Hard Times, designed to revive the declining circulation of household words, while Collins completed Hide and Seek. This book was published and dedicated to Dickens as a token of admiration and affection. Dickens admired the novel, which he described as in some respects masterly. Dickens joined the Thespian Garrick Club in the spring of 1854, and Collins became a member shortly after, one indication of the closeness of their lives. In July, Dickens was in need of a respite from Hard Times, and wrote to Collins, "The interval I propose to pass in a career of amiable dissipation and unbounded license in the metropolis. If you will come and breakfast with me about midnight, anywhere, any day, and go to bed no more until we fly to these pastoral retreats, I shall be delighted to have such a vicious associate." Collins returned to France with Dickens for the rest of July and August. Other visitors included Wills, Egg, C.H. Townshend, and Dickens' oldest friend Thomas Beard, the elder brother of Frank Beard, who became the personal doctor of both Dickens and Collins. In 1855, Collins was invited for the first time to act in the Twelfth Night children's theatricals at Tavistock House. Around the same time, Dickens and Millais dined together at Hanover Terrace, an attempt by Harriet Collins to heal the breach between Dickens and Collins' pre-Raphaelite friends after criticism of the pre-Raphaelites' paintings in Household Words. Collins then accompanied Dickens to Paris for 2 weeks. They stayed in accommodation arranged by Regnier, but Collins' enjoyment was limited by another attack of illness. Whether gout or laudanum withdrawal, we're not sure. Collins' next story, Sister Rose, was published in Household Words during April 1855. Dickens considered it an excellent story, charmingly written, and the French Revolution background may have had some influence on his A Tale of Two Cities. Their next joint project was The Lighthouse, Collins' first play, produced by Dickens at Tavistock House. During the summer of 1855, Collins spent 6 weeks with Dickens at Folkestone, and planning began for the next Christmas edition, The Holly Tree Inn. Collins contributed the ostler to the piece, which later became known as The Dream Woman. Dickens and his family spent the winter of 1855 through 56 in Paris. Collins was invited in January, but was delayed by the first of 3 serious attacks of illness that year, and eventually was able to make it by the end of February. It was during this trip to Paris that he found, while wandering about the streets with Dickens, Méjean's Rasoul de Cas Célèbre, a true story of a woman's wrongful imprisonment, which would influence The Woman in White and the horror genre for years to come. According to The World, Collins had been asked to take up a case of wrongful imprisonment in an asylum in 1883, decades later, due to his assumed expertise in the matter. From the spring of 1856, Collins was contributing more frequently to the weekly Household Words, earning his keep with Dickens. His earnings were increasing, and Dickens wrote to Wills, "I think in such a case as that of Collins, the right thing is to give £50 for a rogue's life, a careful and good writer on whom we can depend for Christmas numbers and the like." By September, Dickens wrote again to Wills with a view to recruiting Collins to the permanent staff. "I have been thinking a good deal about Collins, and it strikes me that the best thing we can just now do for H.W. is to add him on to Morley, and offer him 5 guineas a week. He is very suggestive and exceeding quick to take my notions. Being industrious and reliable besides, I don't think we should be at an additional expense of £20 in the year by the transaction." Dickens preferred Wills to conduct the negotiations, rather than "interpose myself in this stage of the business solely because I think it right that he should consider and decide without any personal influence on my part." Collins ultimately accepted the staff appointment on the understanding that his name would be advertised in advance for any long story. The next key event in their association was the production of The Frozen Deep. Although the play was written by Collins, it was jointly planned and the Arctic theme decided on, capitalizing on interest in British exploration at the poles as early as March 1856. In July, Collins was invited to the French villa, and Dickens wrote, "I am charmed to hear you have discovered so good a notion for the play. Immense excitement is always in action here on the subject, and I don't think Mary and Katie, his daughters, will feel quite safe until you are shut up in the pavilion on pen and ink." Both men grew beards for the play, and Dickens was eventually almost living the part of the self-sacrificing character, Richard Wardour, in an early display of method acting. "Took 20 miles today and got up all Richard's words, to the great terror of Finchley, Neaston, and Williston," Dickens reported. Collins played Wardour's rival, Frank Aldersley, and the first performance took place in January 1857. Supposedly, it is on the stage of The Frozen Deep that Dickens thought of the end of A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens took possession of his new house, Gad's Hill, in February 1857, although he did not move in until May. Collins was one of the first visitors, coinciding with Hans Christian Andersen, who overstayed his welcome and was later parodied in Collins' The Bachelor Bedroom. Dickens finished Little Dorrit and wrote to Collins, "Any mad proposal you please will find a wildly insane response in yours ever, C.D. And if the mind can devise anything sufficiently in the style of Sybarite Rome in the days of its culminating voluptuousness, I am your man. If you can think of any tremendous way of passing the night, in the meantime do. I don't care what it is. I give, for that night only, restraint to the winds." In July 1857, with their newfound chaos, Dickens and Collins resigned from the Garrick Club in support of Edmund Yates in what became known as the Garrick Club affair. Yates, another of Dickens' protégés and members of the Dickens Fellowship, was attacked by Thackeray for publishing gossip he had heard at the club, supposedly a sacrosanct place. Thackeray asked for Yates to be expelled from club membership, and he was. The affair caused a rift between Dickens and Thackeray, only healed shortly before Thackeray's death. When Dickens and Collins' mutual friend Douglas Jerrold died suddenly at the age of 54 in June 1857, a revival of The Frozen Deep was arranged to contribute to a fundraising effort for his widow. Jerrold loved sailing and may have suffered from rickets or arthritis, as he was permanently bowed and disfigured at the end of his life. After the Frozen Deep performances in London, the play transferred to Manchester towards the end of August for 3 public performances with professional actors who included the young Ellen Ternan. Dickens was soon confiding in Collins, "I have never known a moment's peace or content since the last night of the Frozen Deep. Was it love at first sight? And partly in the grim despair and restlessness of this subsidence from excitement, and partly for the sake of the household words, I want to cast about whether you and I can go anywhere, take any tour, see anything, whereon we could write something together. I want to escape from myself. My blankness is inconceivable, indescribable. My misery was amazing." Was this the misery inspired by wanting to separate from Catherine Dickens upon seeing the young Ternan? In 1857, actress Ellen Ternan was spotted by Dickens performing at London's Haymarket Theatre. He cast her on the recommendation of his friend, actor and playwright Alfred Wigan, along with her mother and sister Maria, in 3 performances of The Frozen Deep. As an aside, The Frozen Deep would be a cool video game scenario. It seems like it would be fun for people to play the characters. In mid-September 1857, Dickens went with Collins to Doncaster to see Ellen Ternan perform in The Pet of the Petticoats at the Theatre Royal. Was this his trip to take him out of himself? At the time, he had written to John Forster that the relationship with his wife was disintegrating. "Poor Catherine and I are not made for each other. What is now befalling I have seen steadily coming." Dickens was 45 years old when he met the 18-year-old Ternan, and she was only 6 months older than his youngest daughter, Katie. But from the way he spoke about Katie with his friend Collins, it seems that flirtation with older men and younger women was no problem to Dickens. In 2 books published in 1935 and 1936, Thomas Wright alleged that they had an affair, stating that he heard this from Canon Benham, who claimed that Ternan had confessed it all to him. If so, Dickens kept his affair with Ternan secret from the general public, but the Dickens Fellowship seems to have known about it because they started asking questions after Dickinson's grandchildren, or was it children, not sure, were dead, seemingly keeping tabs on her for decades. There is little evidence pertaining to the nature of Charles Dickens and Ellen Ternan's relationship because neither Dickens, Ternan, nor Ternan's family left any account of the relationship, and they destroyed most correspondence relevant to the relationship. But in pages from Dickens' diary, it seems he may have had a child with Ternan who died in France in infancy. The extramarital escape to Cumberland in September 1857 was written up as the lazy tour of two idle apprentices, published in Household Words the following month. The destination was chosen by Dickens, who knew that Ellen's next engagement was in Doncaster. He decided on a walking tour, finishing at Doncaster for the races and, of course, the theatre. Spring of 1858 saw the separation of Dickens from his wife. Matters came to a head when Catherine Dickens opened a packet delivered by a London jeweler. It contained a gold bracelet meant for turn-in with a note written by her husband. Collins had become the friend on whom Dickens relied for sympathy, due to Collins' strange living arrangement, living with two different women who were neither his wife. But Collins seemed to be sympathetic to Catherine and was one of the few who remained friendly with both Dickens and Catherine. Dickens wrote to Collins in May, "Mr. Dear Wilkie, no longer my dear Collins. 1,000 thanks for your kind letter. I always feel your friendship very much and prize it in proportion to the true affection I have for you." Collins contributed numerous articles to Household Words during 1858, including 2 lead articles on which he collaborated with Dickens, potentially taking some of the pressure off of his friend. He suffered another bout of illness and, escaping from the heat of London to recover, spent August in Broadstairs. A letter from Dickens' Gad's Hill in September invited him to contribute to the next Christmas number, which ultimately became A House to Let. By the beginning of 1859, Dickens dissolved his partnership with Bradbury and Evans and launched his own paper all the year round in April 1859. Both Collins and his brother, who was more of an illustrator, made contributions to the early numbers. Dickens' opening serial, A Tale of Two Cities, was relatively short, and he needed to decide fairly soon on its successor. He could have selected an established or safe author, but he chose Collins, sufficiently confident by this time to rely on his writing as well as his friendship. By the end of 1859, Charles Collins, Collins' brother, not to be confused with his son William Charles, who was born in 1874, had also become a regular visitor to Dickens' household. Charles Collins proposed to Dickens' daughter Kate the following spring. Dickens might have been happy to forge a closer link with the Collins family, although he found adopted daughter Harriet Collins irritating, but he was against the marriage because of his son-in-law's nervous and delicate health, and because he suspected Kate was only marrying to get out of the house. Dickens, however, did not prevent the wedding, which took place in July 1860, with Forster and Townshend as witnesses. 1860 also saw Ellen Ternan leave the stage to become completely financially supported by Dickens. At Gad's Hill in September 1860, Dickens created a bonfire of letters from his literary friends, including Collins, which accounts for the one-sided nature of their surviving correspondence. Also, what went up in flames was his correspondence with and regarding Ellen Ternan. In October, the two writers traveled to the West Country for local color and collaborated on the next Christmas number, A Message from the Sea, which eventually sold over 250,000 copies and remains in print. In January 1861, Collins departed from All the Year Round after 5 years on the staff of this periodical. With the success of his novel, The Woman in White, he had become a household name in his own right and no longer needed a regular salary with the constraints of weekly contributions. Dickens took his resignation in stride, writing, "I am very sorry that we part company, though only in a literary sense, but I hope we shall work together again one day." Perhaps Collins became annoyed at seeing the Dickens name front and center on the position of the top cover of their collaborations. The choice of title for the bestseller, The Woman in White, was difficult. Collins explained that he smoked an entire case of cigars before finding a suitable title, which he found by looking at white buildings. Collins insisted he saw Dickens every day until Dickens' death. But they did not collaborate again until No Thoroughfare in 1867, although Collins contributed one story to Tom Tiddler's Ground that Christmas. Dickens, however, serialized Collins' next novel, No Name, which ran for 45 installments from March 1862 in his periodical. Dickens made several helpful suggestions while still maintaining his editorial authority. In September, he wrote to Collins, "I have gone through the second volume at a sitting, and I find it wonderfully fine. It is as far before and beyond The Woman in White as that was beyond the wretched common level of fiction writing." 1862 was a bad year for Collins' health, and he was so unwell by October that Dickens, hearing of it from Dr. Frank Beard, and remembering his own illness during the writing of Bleak House, volunteered to help. "Write to me at Paris at any moment, and say you are unequal to your work, and want me, and I will come to London straight and do your work. I am quite confident that with your notes and a few words of explanation, I could take it up at any time. I hope that the knowledge may be a comfort to you. Call me, and I come." Collins didn't need to avail himself of this offer, and was able to complete the story himself. No Name was published in book form in December 1862, and a copy was sent to Gad's Hill in time for New Year's Day for Dickens to enjoy. Many thanks for the book, the arrival of which has created an immense sensation in this palatial abode. I am delighted, but not surprised, to hear of its wonderful sale. In the same letter, Dickens mentions that before going to Paris he will vanish into space. Later, in August 1863, he says, "I am thinking of evaporating for a fortnight on the 18th. These disappearances are discreet references to his continuing affair with Ellen Ternan. Dickens was soon to assume the identity of Mr. Tringham of Slough, an interesting parallel with Collins' alter ego, William Dawson. By this time, Collins and Dickens had rejoined the Garrick Club, but when their friend Wills was blackballed, they both resigned for a second time in March 1865. The two writers collaborated for the final time during 1867, writing No Thoroughfare for the Christmas number. Dickens sailed for America from Liverpool in November 1867, leaving Ternan behind so as not to scandalize American audiences, and Collins traveled north for his farewell party. 1867 also saw the serialization of Collins' The Moonstone in All the Year Round. Dickens had written to Wills, "It is prepared with extraordinary care and stands every chance of being a hit. It is in many respects much better than anything he has done." The following year, however, he wrote to Wills in a more critical term, "I quite agree with you about The Moonstone. The construction is wearisome beyond endurance, and there is a vein of obstinate conceit in it that makes enemies of readers." This criticism has been taken as symptomatic of an estrangement between Dickens and Collins. Yet, in December 1867, Dickens had written to Wills with comments such as, "Tell Collins my love," and in June 1868 still signing himself ever affectionately in a letter enthusiastically discussing the Paris production of No Thoroughfare. In 1868, Collins met Martha Rudd in Winterton-on-Sea in Norfolk, and the two began a liaison. She was 19 and from a large, poor family. A few years later, she moved to London to be closer to him. Their daughter, Marion, was born in 1869, their second daughter, Harriet Constance, in 1871, seemingly named after Collins' adopted daughter with Caroline Graves, which is sort of shocking, and their son, William Charles, in 1874. When he was with Martha, Collins assumed the name William Dawson, and she and their children used the last name of Dawson. For the last 20 years of his life, Collins divided his time between the widow Caroline Graves, who lived with him at his home in Gloucester Place, and Martha, who was nearby. It's possible that this domestic arrangement strained his friendship with Dickens. Collins almost certainly met Martha Rudd during the summer of 1864, when she was 19 and working at an inn and he had turned 40. He stayed at the Victoria Hotel in Great Yarmouth while researching locations for his book Armadale. The exact date when Martha came to London is uncertain, but she was installed by Collins at 33 Bolsover Street by 1868. This is likely to have been connected with Caroline Graves' temporary departure from Gloucester Place during her brief marriage to Joseph Clow, since she was rightfully angry that Collins wouldn't marry her after the success of The Woman in White. Whether Martha's arrival caused the temporary rift between Wilkie and Caroline, or whether she simply gave him an ultimatum over marriage, is uncertain, but in October 1868, Caroline was married. Collins himself was present at the ceremony in Marylebone Parish Church. By April 1871, however, Caroline had returned to Gloucester Place and continued to live with Wilkie until his death in 1889. She died in 1895. Collins lies buried with Caroline Elizabeth Graves. She was 61 when she died and the widow of a George Robert Graves. After Mrs. Graves' death, Collins' grave was for a time under the care of Martha Rudd. These two women, Mrs. Graves and Martha Rudd, had shared Collins' bequest. To Mrs. Graves, Collins left his gold studs and gold sleeve links and some furniture, £200, and one moiety of the income from his estate. To Martha Rudd, his watch and chain, £200, and a moiety of the income from his estate. After the death of Mrs. Graves, her share of the income was to pass to her daughter, Elizabeth Harriet. In the record of her marriage, dated early in 1878, Elizabeth Harriet, called Harriet Elizabeth Laura Graves, gave her age as 24, so she was born about 1854. The heroine of The Woman in White may therefore have been named after her, or after Collins' mother. One cannot be entirely certain about her exact relationship to Collins. Was she more than a foster daughter? After the death of Martha Rudd, the Dawson children, seemed to disappear from the record. According to the painter Millais, as his father and Wilkie and Charles Collins were walking one night, they saw a beautiful young woman dressed in white approach, hesitate as if in distress, and walk on, to be followed by Wilkie Collins. Collins later told his companions that the young woman, from a good family, had fallen into the power of an unscrupulous man who had subjected her to threats and mesmeric influences of an alarming nature. Kate Dickens, who married Charles Collins, Wilkie's brother, is said to have believed that it was the fugitive in white who afterwards lived with Collins. If her belief was correct, the young woman was Caroline Elizabeth Graves, whose name is listed in London directories under the same address as Collins. It is noteworthy, if not especially significant, that The Fallen Leaves, one of Collins' most daring books, and one which incurred considerable censure because of the socialist hero befriending and finally marrying a girl of the streets, was dedicated to Caroline. In January 1874, during his American reading tour, Collins learned that the landlord wished to sell his house. On his return, he moved Martha Rudd briefly to 55 Marylebone Road and then to a cottage at 10 Taunton Place at the top of Gloucester Place and close to Hanover Terrace, where Wilkie had lived in the 1850s. Martha remained here, listed in the post office directory, for the next 16 years. Their youngest child, William Charles Collins Dawson, Charlie, was also registered, but the births of the two girls, his sisters, were not registered. There are hints in Dickens' correspondence which suggest that one probable cause of any estrangement with Collins was his annoyance at the increasing entanglements of Collins' life. Another cause was Collins' brother and his son-in-law. Charles Collins had been struggling since his marriage with both the difficulties of earning a living and the early symptoms of stomach cancer. Dickens, apart from employing him as his son-in-law on all the year round, doubled Kate's marriage portion in 1867 and further gave Charles £150 in 1867 and £350 in 1868. He also agreed that Charles should provide the illustrations for The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Despite the apparent cooling of their friendship, Collins still visited Gad's Hill for a week in September 1869 and invited Dickens and family that year to the first night of Black and White. In January 1870, Dickens wrote a formal letter, requested by Collins for legal reasons, establishing his copyright to everything by him published in Household Words and All the Year Round. I can have no hesitation in stating you have the right, hereby freely acknowledged, of disposing of and publishing the same novels, tales, and articles in any way you think proper. The accompanying less formal note concludes, I don't come to see you because I don't want to bother you. Perhaps you may be glad to see me by and by. Who knows? This was apparently the last letter Collins received from Dickens, who died in June 1870. Collins was shocked by the news and attended the funeral, traveling in the same coach as his brother and Dr. Frank Beard. Collins took opium from the early 1860s onwards in the form of laudanum to alleviate the symptoms of gout and rheumatism. There were no legal restrictions on the use of opium until 1868, and it was the chief ingredient of many patent medicines. You can learn more about it in the Branwell-Bronte videos on this channel. Collins recorded in the Memoirs of William Collins, R.A. of 1848, that to relieve pain, his painter father took Batley's drops, which contained opium, sherry, alcohol, calcium hydrate, and distilled water. Common brand names of patent opium medicines included Batley's sedative solution, Dalmy's carminative, Godfrey's cordial, and Mother Bailey's quieting syrup. Opium was regularly prescribed by Collins' doctor and friend Frank Beard as a painkiller and sedative, and Beard provided ample doses. Despite various attempts to give up the habit, using hypnosis by John Elliotson in 1863 and morphia by injection in 1869, Collins took increasingly large doses by the tablespoon, until in later life he became totally dependent. In an 1869 letter written from his home, Gloucester Place, he writes, "One line, written most unwillingly, to ask you to forgive me if I am absent tomorrow night. My doctor is trying to break me of the habit of drinking laudanum. I am stabbed every night at 10 with a sharp-pointed syringe, which injects morphia under my skin, and gets me a night's rest without any of the drawbacks of taking opium internally. If I only persevere with this, I am told I shall be able, before long, gradually to diminish the quantity of morphia and the number of nightly stabbings, and so emancipate myself from opium altogether." Collins' insistence on living in sin can't have helped his physical and mental state. The Bancrofts related Collins' difficulty in obtaining opium in Switzerland, and also told the story of a dinner party with the ophthalmologist George Critchett, where the famous surgeon Sir William Ferguson agreed Collins' normal dose was sufficient to kill every man seated at the table. Edmund Yates, in his 1889 obituary, recorded that Collins was in the habit of taking daily more laudanum than would have sufficed to kill a ship's crew or company of soldiers. Hall Caine claimed he saw Collins drink laudanum by the wine glass to stimulate the brain and steady the nerves, and told the unsubstantiated and probably false story that Collins' manservant killed himself by drinking just half a glass. William Winter recalled Collins saying, "Opium sometimes hurts, but also sometimes it helps." Despite an enormous tolerance to the drug, Collins admitted that he experienced hallucinations. He began to be disturbed by the movement of shadows in his gas-lit study, and phantoms would follow him upstairs to bed, where a green woman with tusks would wait for him. Compared to fentanyl, which over 100,000 Americans die of annually, laudanum sounds relatively harmless. The nightmares caused by opium are vividly described by the character Ezra Jennings in The Moonstone, where the drug forms an integral part of the plot. Collins described how he wrote much of the book under the effects of opium and, when finished, hardly recognized the work as his own. There are many references to opium in his work, including in No Name, where a character states, "Who was the man who invented laudanum? I thank him from the bottom of my heart." And then in Miss or Mrs. of 1871, the smell of opium was in the room, and the composing medicine appropriated by Eunice in 1888's The Legacy of Cain stimulates a typically laudanum-induced hallucination. In 1878, Collins stated he had been asked to complete Dickens' unfinished novel Edwin Drood, but had positively refused. He also refused to publish any reminiscences of Dickens, but did help Georgina Hogarth with her 3-volume edition of Dickens' letters, suggesting many omissions which he felt advisable. He insisted on his gravestone bearing the words, "The author of The Woman in White," as he considered it his best work, despite the critical acclaim of The Moonstone. During the 1880s, Wilkie's always delicate health continued to decline. Breathing difficulties due to heart problems became more common, and he resorted to capsules of amyl nitrate and hypophosphate. In January 1889, he was involved in an accident and thrown from a cab by the force of the collision. There followed a severe attack of bronchitis. He suffered a stroke in June and with further complications died in September 1889. He was the author of dozens of books, articles, and plays. In 1876, 6 years after Dickens' death, and maintaining her £1,000 beneficiary from his estate, which did not require her to work, Ellen Ternan married George Wharton Robinson, an Oxford graduate, 12 years her junior, who knew nothing of her close association with Dickens. She presented herself as 14 years younger, 23 years old rather than 37. The couple had a son, Geoffrey, and a daughter, Gladys, and ran a boys' school in Margate. Ternan's husband died in 1910, and she spent her last years in Southsea with her sister Frances. She died in Fulham, London in April 1914 and is buried in Highland Road Cemetery in Portsmouth, the city of Dickens' birth. The Dickens Fellowship and the surviving close family members of Charles Dickens maintained a complete silence about the relationship between Ellen Ternan and Charles Dickens from the time of Charles Dickens' death in 1870 until the death in December 1933 of his last surviving child, Sir Henry Fielding Dickens. Starting in 1939, several Dickens researchers started to peel away the layers of the romance with Ellen Ternan, including Collins' participation. A recent film, The Invisible Woman of 2013, which seems to be a pretty poor title for a woman who was very visible to much of the Dickens Fellowship, also explored her life. What do you think of Collins and his many works?